What happens when you turn Russia into North Korea? You turn off the energy supply that Russia has provided. What will happen? There's two things that can happen. One is prices go up a lot and then innovation picks up, and things that were already on the way will accelerate, such as, for example, the decarbonization of the energy infrastructure. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's March 7th, 2022. This is Krim Delco. For today, the fund is down roughly 3%. The market's down 2.5%. For the year, we're down 29.5%. The market is down 11.5%. We're underperforming by 18%. So let's talk about, in general, what happens when you turn off a market. So you turn off a market like we are doing right now with Russia. The supply goes down, prices go up. This is what we're seeing right now. There's no magic here. The question, of course, is how is this going to pan out? So we're going to have some short-term inflation, of course, but I think in the long term, this is actually a good thing. The best thing that can happen to the energy markets is that the prices go up. Or in other words, if you're an energy supplier, the last thing you want is oil to go to $200 a barrel. Why? Because then alternative energies will by definition be a lot more palatable for anybody, consumers, politicians. So all these questions about certificates and all that stuff, and I think I completely disagree with the people that are still promoting some sort of carbon certificate, particularly in Europe. I think that train has passed now, because we have, for the time being, we will have very high energy prices and other prices, particularly energy, which is because we're cutting off Russia from the global markets. Russia is turning into North Korea. Now, Russia itself as an economy is not as important. 1.7 trillion in GDP is not that much. It's less than Italy. So you can turn off Italy from the global markets. You can turn off Spain from the global markets. You can turn off Russia from the global markets. It doesn't really affect much in terms of trade flows, supply, demand, all that stuff. However, when it comes to commodities, Russia does have an outsized plays an outsized role. So for example, in oil, I would say probably about 20 to 30% of global traded oil, so the oil that is being exported around the world, comes from Russia. So that means that it's not the global oil market as a whole, of course, which is roughly 100 million barrels per day, and Russia is about 10% of that, and of which only half is exported. So 5% of the global oil market is being exported out of Russia, but of course, not every country exports, namely the US, consumes almost everything that we produce here. So in other words, the actual export market is smaller, and of that, Russia has a much bigger share. So given all of that, we have higher prices now for oil, we have higher prices for nat gas and wheat and some other things that come out of Russia and the Ukraine. And the question now is, how does this typically pan out? And I want to say that in general, what we're going to see in the next 3 years is, and of course this is a conjecture, this is not investment advice, please do your own work. This is just a conjecture. This is the purpose of this podcast, is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. We're trying to share our thoughts. We're trying to give people a sense for how we think about these things. Please do your own work. So what we think will happen is that alternative energies, alternative infrastructure solutions, alternative energy sources, alternative transport sources, all of these things will proliferate into a completely new dimension. So a little bit like Y2K or the COVID pandemic, when we had a rush in the name of Y2K, we had a rush into IT investments to get rid of that Y2K problem. In the COVID times, we had a rush to digitization, remote work. Now we're going to have a rush into alternative energies, away from oil, away from gas, because it's expensive and because we don't want to depend on rogue states like Russia. So this is what's going to happen. I think the zeitgeist is already there. We're just going to have to stomach this. Fortunately for us, we are exposed to this through Tesla. Tesla is by far the best vehicle to be invested in any of those things, because this is what Tesla has been talking about. Elon Musk has been talking about this in his investor letters ever since he started Tesla. I also want to throw in there actually all these other companies, SpaceX and the humanoid robots stuff that they're doing, and even Neuralink, but and the tunnel company. But let's just focus on Tesla right now. Tesla Tesla's mission is to accelerate the advent of sustainable energy and autonomy. And what that means is that, in a nutshell, decarbonize the energy infrastructure, decarbonize transport, and get energy from different sources, namely the sun. This is what Tesla is all about. And I think, given what's going on right now in the world, geopolitically, financial market-wise, there is no better place to be invested in than Tesla. Of course, we will have short-term hiccups, volatilities, all these kinds of things that can be very difficult. We also have a risk that Tesla can be attacked by Russian forces, factories can be blown up, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of risks involved in this thesis. It's not a foregone conclusion. We at Orange Capital Partners have a very high conviction investment strategy that is also very risky, because the ultimate constraint in every hedge fund is to survive. You need to survive. Like, let's say in biology or in any kind of evolutionary organism, the fundamental constraint into whatever you do is always you have to survive. Because if you don't survive, what's the point, right? So in this context, also we have to be sure we can survive. Given our large position that we have in Tesla, I would say we're not fully aligned with that constraint, and it would make sense to put some runaway money aside. This is me talking out loud here. We have some runaway money in other investments, but they're not necessarily big enough maybe to help us survive. So to just give a sense, we have about roughly 20% of our assets in other types of investments, non-Tesla related. So, and there's also a good chance that we probably will not see Tesla go to zero, even in the worst case. So there's probably a good cushion of, let's say, 50%. So we're looking at a maximum drawdown of maybe 60% from here, something like that, 60% from here, where we are today. That's kind of what we live with. And if we have that, we will be forced sellers because of our leverage. So that's definitely a negative scenario, but we will not be wiped out. And in the long term, we think that Tesla as an asset will do extremely well because of all these aspects that we just talked about. And I think it's worth sometimes to go back in history. For example, there is an analogy here. It's a little bit of a controversial analogy, but I still want to use it because it comes from the Hardcore History podcast, where they talk about the Atlantic slave trade. And as controversial and as dehumanizing that whole subject is, there are a few economic lessons to be learned from that. And one of them is that what happened during those times before Christopher Columbus discovered the New World was that we had the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. So the whatever East Roman Empire or Byzantine was fell to the Turks, and they closed the. In those days, there was a very vibrant slave trade going on between sort of the East Asian steppes and the Slavic regions in the what's called Eastern Europe today, and that whole slave trade got cut off. And there was also another interesting analogy here, which is that particularly in the Christian societies, sort of the notion that Christians should not be slaves anymore started to be, let's say, started to evolve throughout the zeitgeist. So in other words, we had a very similar situation like today, where we have this carbon neutral, decarbonizing energy zeitgeist anyway. And on top of that, we have, in this case, it's not Constantinople, it's Russia, but it's kind of somewhere in Eastern Europe. There's a big cutoff of trade. And in both cases, what happens is the supply of an important commodity, back then it was slaves in the sort of East Asia, Europe slave trade, that was cut off. And then we have also this notion that Christians shouldn't be slaves. So we have a similar things. History rhymes. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And this rhymes extremely well. Unfortunately, for humanity's sake, I think what happened in those days back then was that the Atlantic slave trade was evolved, and all the bad things that came with that. And I hope in this case today we have a much better outcome, which is that we start to look for alternatives and innovations, not by dehumanizing people, but by actually innovating and figuring out new technologies, concepts, engineering practices to solve the problem. This is exactly what Tesla is doing. Solving the problem of energy is finding ways to capture the sun, store it in batteries, and then use it in electric cars. This is fundamentally what the Tesla business is. It can be, of course, expanded to, let's say, the mega pack type stuff on the storage side, where we have basically, in general, a solution for intermittency of renewable energies. We have, let's say, done a very quick math that it would take probably about $500 billion to store enough energy in Germany to make Germany fully renewable. So meaning all the energy can come from renewables, and the storage side of things can be solved with about $500 billion of investment. Of course, you also need investment in the capturing of the power through wind and solar and all these things. But if you had this intermittency solved through storage, you could have Germany being fully renewable, completely independent of any kind of nat gas from Russia. It doesn't solve necessarily the transportation problem, because you have to add to the current consumption of electricity, and this whole math is based on the current consumption of electricity. You would have to add on top of that, of course, the consumption of power through transportation. But the math is such that within the realm of possibility, $500 billion is a lot for Germany, but it's a lot less than having a conflict with Russia. A lot less, no matter how you look at it, from a human toll and a financial toll. And this applies to all the other countries in the world. We at Orange Capital Partners are not believers in nuclear power, just simply because nuclear power is too risky to have. And also, well, like we've seen in the Ukraine, unfortunately, you can become a hostage to terrorism or rogue states. They can blow up your nuclear power plants. So you don't want to have these things. The NIMBY concept, nuclear power plants, makes a lot of sense. If it makes sense anywhere, it makes sense in nuclear power plants. So we have to put this constraint on ourselves now with high energy prices. It's going to cause havoc. It's going to cause inflation. It's going to cause particularly lower income people to suffer. It's going to create havoc probably in our interest rates and bond markets, because the Fed will be forced to lower rates because of the recession that's coming. But then we could have a stagflation where we have higher prices and a recession. So it's really bad. It's kind of like a late 70s solution. But we came out of the late 70s. We had a very, very successful economy ever since, so we can do the same now. And the reason we're very positive about this is because we have all the ingredients. We have a company like Tesla already operating, and many, many copycats will follow, companies that will do things maybe even better, but at least as good or just slightly worse than Tesla, solve collectively the problem of energy for once and for all. And that is, first, get rid of the carbonized energy. Second, get rid of being hostage to rogue states such as Russia. And third, also most importantly, find new ways to harness the energy of the sun and therefore also create new jobs, better jobs, which is also better for the environment and most importantly also better for global peace. Thank you.